Oh, there you go. I don't know if you heard that. It said recording in progress.
Did, yeah.
Right. Yes, looks like that has worked. Okay, so good morning to anyone that is joining us. Looks like the room is filling up now, which is great. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes for everybody to log on. So just to confirm, you have joined the webinar for differentiating yourself. That's a hard word to say, I've just decided. Differentiating yourself in the tender process.
Morning all.
Okay, so we've got quite a few people that have joined us already, and we're bang on 10 o'clock. So we'll give it a couple of minutes just to let anyone else who may be struggling to get on. We know what it's like with Zoom these days. Sometimes it's not our best friend straight away. So whilst we wait for that, just to make sure everybody can hear me okay. My name's Jennifer. I am from ISO Quality Services, and we are hosting this webinar alongside JDP Procurement, and Sukraj will introduce himself, I'm sure, in a moment. But whilst we just wait for everybody to join, could you just all pop in the chat kind of where you're joining us from today? Al, good morning. Yeah, maybe just where you're joining us from today, and maybe just give us a word to summarize how your week's going so far. We're on Thursday, if you can believe it, Thursday, the 4th of November. I cannot believe it's November, really. Scary.
Good morning, Robert. It looks like you're joining us from Trinidad and Tobago. So, well, it's definitely a lot warmer there than it is here in Worcester today.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so we're both in Worcester. Oh, Sydney.
Oh, lovely.
I'm going to get jealous now of all the lovely climates that are going to be joining us today. Thank God we haven't got pictures of your from your offices. That would be really depressing for us over in the UK. Okay, so we'll just give it another couple of minutes just to let everybody join in. Oh, we've got another Worcestershire.
Here we are.
Right.
Having numbers.
Fab. So for anyone else that's just joined, my name's Jennifer from ISO Quality Services. If we are looking to find out where you're from, so somebody from Leicestershire. What's the weather like in Leicestershire? Is it cold and bright like it is here? And just a word in the chat just to let us know how your week is going so far. Yeah, Leicestershire's got the same weather as us. I think the whole of the UK is on cold and bright at the moment.
Yeah.
We'll just give it another minute or so before I hand over to Sukraj, and then we can get going. Oh, South Birmingham. Good morning, Dave from Sabre Jetting. Oh, Glasgow, lovely, having a busy week. I think that's the theme, actually. Everybody I speak to this week, I think it's because it was half term in the UK for the schools last week, and this week just seems to have gone crazy.
I can echo that, Caitlin. Absolutely. I can't believe it's Thursday, to be honest. I was just saying to Jennifer before we set up the call. Weeks are flying by. Not many Thursdays until Christmas now, I guess.
Oh God, don't say that. Today's actually a holiday here in Trinidad, but the week's been good, but it's raining. Oh, okay. I don't feel too jealous then. Russ, welcome, Russ from Beaumont Traffic. Fab. Well, I think we'll get going, and I'm sure other people will join us as we go. So, as I said, my name's Jennifer. I'm from ISO Quality Services. We are leaders in ISO certification. And we are wanting to bring you this webinar mainly because obviously the certifications and public sector or even private sector tendering are very closely linked. It's kind of a core reason why a lot of our clients look at getting the ISO is because it's a requirement on tenders. So we thought it'd be quite good to kind of join up with JDP Procurement. Sukraj, who's joined us today, who I'll let him introduce what he does for them himself, and just to kind of go through some of those little tactics and top tips and some insider information I think we're looking for today. So I'll pass over to you, Sukraj, now, and I'll let you take control of the screen. We do have a question and answer function available on Zoom. I'm sure we're all familiar with Zoom. If you're not, there is a Q&A where you can pop your questions. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And there is a chat function, obviously, which we can see is working already. So please feel free to pop any musings in the chat, any ideas, any comments, and then any questions in the Q&A. We'll be more than happy to kind of answer those as we go through. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over, and yeah, the floor's all yours.
Super. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. Just as a brief introduction to today, so as Jennifer sort of introduced there, so I'm looking to go through the tendering bid management side of things today, and just essentially provide you with a bit more detail as to some of the challenges, what to consider, and some useful tips just to help navigate through that. So I'm going to go through the content shortly, but I think just as an introduction, I'm the Director of Service Delivery at JDP. So who are JDP? We're effectively a small consultancy that bring together experience and expertise to make immediate impacts on procurement thinking, supply chain thinking, direction and performance. So what we major on really is offering independent, trusted advisory support to in-house and in-house teams via our associate and in-house network. But also we look to partner with clients as well to deliver our service lines, which I'm going to go on to shortly. So we've got quite a vast number of years under our belt in terms of delivering for clients across various sectors, whether it's the public sector, the private sector, but also a range of industries which range from engineering, financial services, professional services, retail, transport, for instance. So by the end of this session, what should you have? So I just wanted to just manage expectations in terms of this this particular session today. So what I'm hoping to take you through is an understanding of the route to market choices. So in picking up a tender, how can you interpret whether it's a public or private sector, and what does that mean? So if you pick up a tender, for instance, and it's a public sector, do you need to react differently if it's private sector? If it's public sector one, what are the rules and regs associated with that? So I'm just hoping to just take you through some of that today. Advice on how you can actually position your organisation and bid, which I feel is quite a major thing to go through, really, because depending on what your business strategy is as well, certain contracts that may come your way, it may fall within your core competence, it may fall without. So this session will actually just go through ways in which you can sort of navigate through that, and also some useful tips and considerations towards the back end as well. I think Jennifer mentioned just as we started as well, that if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and if we've got time at the end, I'll be more than happy to answer some of those. So if I can just take you through briefly JDP's service lines, it's sort of just to paint the picture as a bid management and ways in which you can take this forward. So initially, resource augmentation is a service line that we major on. So that's essentially where we support clients with resource in response to a capacity or capability challenge that they may have in-house. So we could offer short or longer term solutions to help bolster their in-house teams with some knowledgeable experts and technical experts just to support that BAU delivery. We also major on opportunity assessments, where we go in and evaluate an organisation's procurement and supply chain effectiveness and efficiencies. So that's a real end-to-end examination of how they operate. We assess current state spend, contract data. We categorise from that supplier spend and benchmark it in line item detail, just to identify some cost benefit opportunities. As well, it also opens up some avenues to look at ways in which they can consolidate and leverage spend, and ways in which they can work more closely with their supply base. So some of the outputs that we get to that is generally a pipeline of large deliverable, measurable procurement benefits and a lasting legacy to organic growth. So some transformation projects that we work on. So for instance, we worked on with clients fairly recently as well, where we've gone in effectively and rewrote new processes, procedures, policies, implemented practical tools, toolkits, templates, and essentially looked at an end-to-end procurement and supply chain redesign and restructure, just in order to develop what their in-house offering can do in terms of service for their internal business. And on the back of that, what we do is we also implement measurable ways in which risk can be managed on the back of that also. If we can just look at governance training and mentoring, that's also, we also champion that as well. So we also work with organisations in terms of supporting their internal audits and ongoing team development. But in terms of the focus today, what I wanted to focus on was that bid management service line that we have, where essentially organisations do actually struggle with understanding procurement processes. SMEs struggle with understanding procurement processes and a lot of the red tape associated with that. So what we do actually, we work closely with their in-house procurement team and look at ways in which, and the in-house sales team and BD, look at ways in which we can optimise how they're bidding, whether it's a case of training their in-house team or perhaps running a process on behalf of them. So managing an actual bid process itself. So on the back of that, what we hope to deliver for clients and what we measure ourselves against is increased sales and business growth, a measure in how an organisation can actually outperform competitors, and really driving that optimum return on investment when bidding, because as we know, the bidding process, it can be very expensive in terms of hours lost, resource burnt in producing proposals. Could be in the form of engineering drawings perhaps, or even just formally in the process, in the form of actually just people actively working on a project. And depending on which sector you're in, you might not get, if you're unsuccessful for instance, you might not get that level of continuous improvement feedback that's required. So what we do hope to do is just really enhance an organisation's position in the marketplace and help shape the service proposition. And that's just going further into some of our bid management support offerings, where we do actually look at ways in which we can support organisations with bid writing, the actual presentations in terms of presenting back bids, but also in terms of interpreting the evaluation, which I'm going to touch upon towards the back end of this presentation, in terms of focusing a proposal around it could be around the metrics or the key deliverables expected by a client when you're actually going out to bid on a piece of work that they're actually put out to market. So what are the routes to market? So there's both the public and private sector. So both sectors have completely different set of rules and regs. So everything in the public sector, whether it's through local authorities, education authorities such as higher education institutes, universities, colleges, schools, local councils, but any public body, everything must be compliant with a set of stringent regulations called the PCR 2015 regs, which is the public contracts regulations. So the premise on public sector and everything around the procurement process there is actually driven for maximising competition and value for money. And value for money essentially goes beyond cost. So that would actually just factor in any intrinsic value that a bid would actually deliver in terms of from an end product perspective. So it's not just a case of just choosing the lowest cost option. One of the real strengths of the process, essentially, that it is very highly transparent in the fact that everything's published. It's a very set process in terms of if you were to bid on a piece of work in the public sector, they generally, depending on the spend value, they generally follow a pretty set structured process. So you'll know what to do from the onset in terms of early engagement. It might be in the form of pre-market engagement, such as questionnaires, etc. And then obviously going as you dig deeper into the detail and work through technical requirements, the evaluation process is communicated up front as well. So for that which is very much key in terms of being successful in bidding, you need to ensure that you're bidding to the buyer's requirements. If they, for instance, value sustainability or social value as a key driver for what they feel is going to be a successful solution for them, but in a contract, then it's important that you can tailor your bid around them in that regard. So the second materially different type of route to market is private sector. So there's no legal requirement as such to make private tenders public. It's ultimately generally driven by a procurement policy and strategy that an organisation will have within the private sector. So they may have something in the form of a procurement strategy, a category strategy, but that they write for a period of time. And then any suppliers within that category strategy, they would then, on the back of, if there's a new requirement, they would then tender work within that approved pool effectively. The consideration there is that ultimately firms in the private sector, they're not bound by the same set of regulations on transparency, and that transparency also stems into the evaluation process. So there's a slight unknown, I guess, unless you're given some very black and white guidance on the evaluation side of things as to what to expect for what a buyer considers a successful proposal. So you won't necessarily have the evaluation criteria communicated up front within a tender pack, for instance, or within a pre-market engagement process. So it could be a case of that, you've tailored a proposal. If we just use that social value and sustainability example, again, you may have actually tailored your proposal around, let's say, for instance, a compliance piece around, let's say, modern slavery. For instance, you've tailored a solution around modern slavery, whereas they were perhaps looking for a bid that perhaps harness more of a technical output. So from that perspective, there is risk associated with that, which I'm going to go on to shortly. So I just really wanted to just provide a snapshot here. Firstly, if we just look at the public sector, so I think the real key headline to highlight here is that 46% of awarded contracts were below 100k, and that's based on a sample size that I just took from a period from September to October this year. That highlights quite a significant opportunity from an SME perspective, because I guess the common perception out there is that from SMEs who may have been a bit in the past is that a lot of the public sector contracts are high value. They require high levels of compliance in terms of insurances, regulatory compliance. It's almost too expensive to actually consider bidding on those type of contracts, on those public sector contracts for that basis, and it's almost an investment just to actually pull together an actual proposal itself. So what I wanted to highlight there effectively is that there is a level of work and spend thresholds that below 100k and below the OJEU threshold as well. It carries a different set of rules, regulations, although those compliances they have a different sort of threshold and different levels of delegation. So obviously for the high value contracts, if you're looking at contracts much beyond 6 figures, it will carry that different level of compliance and governance associated with that. I also wanted to highlight as well where the industry activity lies as well over those contracts that I just took a brief snapshot from. So there's very much these trends are generally in line with what's what we can sort of annualize and break out over a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year period. In the fact that local governments and local authorities essentially have the work, have the bulk of the lower value work. I say lower value, anything below 100k, that is certainly in scope for an SME, and that obviously differs as you go into different industries. So, for instance, local authorities generally have localized sets of values, principles, localized frameworks that they work to, where they may have an initiative, for instance, to actually work more closely with SMEs. Whereas on a wider basis, if you were to take, for instance, I don't know, utilities, transport, defence, for instance, they have more, they're less regionalised in terms of their strategies, their procurement strategies. It is a wider piece linked to wider and longer programme times and cycle times as well, which means that instead of having like a tailored regional strategy where they'll choose to partner with SMEs, they may look wider just purely based on the complexity of their requirements, and the local supply chains may not be able to support them with some of those requirements. Another key point that I really wanted to highlight on this slide essentially was that there has been a procurement green paper over the course of last year or so, which is currently going through review, whereby the government effectively is actually looking to drive more SME business through procurement. That's one of the outputs of the green paper. However, it is actually still within a consultation phase at this point. But I think it's sort of underpinned with some of the strategic outputs that's coming out from the cabinet at the moment about the government wants £1 out of every £3 to be of public spend to actually go through SMEs by 2022. Be interesting to see actually, and just calculate, how they're getting on with that initiative as well. I think that's probably going to follow on the back of some of the items coming out of the green paper once that's been reviewed. So public sector. So how do you, just digging a bit deeper into the sort of mechanics over how you would actually go and access business opportunities? So anything within the public sector, whether it's local authority, whether it's defence, consultancy, utilities, is actually published through contract notices effectively, and that could be found through various means effectively. It could be on the government tender portal, could be on a tender electronic database called TED. These are all open databases and open websites that you can actually access if you just Google them through. There's also some independent procurement portals as well, where organisations actually provide notifications to suppliers that sign up, but SMEs that sign up effectively, and they can provide alerts as and when certain contracts come through based on what they've filtered it through. So in order to start the sort of process, then you'll be expected to I guess express an interest to a buyer. So say hypothetically, if you found a contract, so as a question, you've identified a contract, you want to bid for it, what are the next steps? So I guess firstly, express an interest to the buyer. Early engagement's always key. So once you've found the opportunity and that you're confident that your organisation can fulfil the terms of the contract, and the next step essentially is just to show that the buyer that you're interested. That could be in the form of a formal response, in the form of an expression of interest. And the stage is generally pretty straightforward, and it involves contacting whoever the buyer is, and whoever the authority or institution is, and requesting the full documentation pack, or you could perhaps just download it yourself if it's available electronically on some of those databases that we've got mentioned on the slide, such as TED and the tender portal. If the opportunity, for instance, uses what's called a single stage open procedure, you'll essentially be asked to submit a full tender at that point. And at that point, for the vast majority of the opportunities, buyers generally use restricted procedures, or what's the equivalent of that is essentially a two-stage procedure. That's it, in essence, to whittle down the number of applicants before the tender stage. That could be in the form of sending out pre-qualification questionnaires, standard questionnaires, where there's basic financial statements and declarations required. Could be in the form of insurance certificates. And I know lately, certainly since GDPR has gone live over the last couple of years, in the form of, say, cyber essentials, or perhaps even some accreditation around information security. And the pre-qualification questionnaires essentially obtain further information which for the buyer, which would actually help that selection process. And then it would naturally then progress to that full tender stage, that ITT, where after the PQQ has been received and buyers assessed, evaluated, the buyer would actually send out that main tender pack, and that could be in the form of say a formal notification whereby an SME could be contacted to invite a supplier to submit a full response. And this is where it slightly differs. So I mentioned it earlier as well that the private and public sector regs and ways in which they source are very different. The private sector is considered a bit more dynamic in the fact that tendering is not necessarily any form of there's no obligation to tender. There's a lot less what's perceived as red tape because the processes are less structured. From a public sector perspective, if you were to know the value of a contract, for instance, if it's above threshold, you'll know what the actual stages are of each particular section, what the milestones are. You can plan business activity around that. You could plan the activity around that when you're actually bidding. Whereas on a private sector perspective, you won't necessarily get that level of transparency in terms of what the stages look like. It might be a case of sending out a tender pack, an RFQ, and it's a case of you might be expected to bid back by a certain date, and you may not actually get the transparency in terms of evaluation, what that evaluation criteria is. It shouldn't be the case. I guess good practice would show that in order to be as transparent as possible, all stages should actually be documented out. A lot of in the private sector as well, a lot of the sourcing is centered around SRM, supplier relationship management, whereby a firm may already have a supply base that they use. I'll touch upon the category strategies and procurement strategies earlier as well, where they may actually have suppliers what they consider in strategy, where they would, if there is a requirement, they would go out, negotiate with them directly for the delivery of services that they could provide, and where if a contract potentially does go out to tender, it doesn't necessarily make it as open as a public sector. So within the public sector, it's effectively it's out there, it's in the public domain, published to the world. You don't necessarily get that in the private sector. It's very controlled from that perspective. So often in the private sector as well, buyers don't necessarily have the intention to change suppliers, which is a considerable risk really, because I guess established supplier relationships have built up over a number of years. And you might get category strategies and procurement strategies that are in place for quite a long cycle time. So it could be a case of a 3 to 5 year strategy whereby an organisation, a private sector organisation, has embedded 2 suppliers, 3 suppliers, 4 suppliers, whatever, however complex that category area is, and it could be quite difficult to actually break up that relationship. Could be a constrained market on the other hand, where the threat of new entrants is quite low, the threat of substitutions is quite low as well. But these are certainly risks to consider in the fact that it could be quite difficult to actually break up some of those established relationships in the private sector. So, bid considerations. Should you bid? So once you've identified a contract opportunity, whether it's public or private sector, these rules generally apply regardless, in essence. I think the key really is to really review that specification, really review what the technical requirements are. So if I just go through the JDP quick guide to considerations that's been put together, consider those technical requirements. Could your organisation satisfy or exceed the technical requirements? Is the requirement in line with your business strategy and organisational marketing positioning, for instance? Does it in the form of, does it align with your business strategy? Can you afford the time and resource investment required to bid? I think that's quite a key one, because ultimately, if it's not successful, can you afford for it not to be successful? Because often you may find, and we've come across organisations as well, where they put a lot of work into proposals, whether they're small or large businesses, and that it burns up resource effectively in that regard as well. And also there's a lot of time and cost in the form of that goes beyond resource as well, in the form of product. Can you ensure that there's a focus on aligning responses to evaluation criteria? I think absolutely that it's key to actually understand that evaluation criteria and scoring weightings, all proposals really, anything submitted, whether it's public or private sector. The strong recommendation really is to really get an understanding, press the buyer as to what the evaluation criteria looks like. I think they clear direction as a if you can achieve clear direction as to what the buyer is actually prioritising and looking to from in selecting the winning bid, that's only going to drive a much stronger bid. And I think writing effectively, an important point there to sort of bring up is that in the writing and submission of our full tender response, that's essentially where a contract can either be won or lost. To some degrees, so it's absolutely imperative really that an organisation invests the necessary time, resources, just to ensure that it can be as good as it can be and stand out. And I think the sort of the objective measure for standing out is via that evaluation criteria and understanding what the scoring weightings are. And a strong consideration really should be in any case just to consider putting together a bid team and creating a bid team. So JDP essentially can support with training, whether it's from training the in-house team or perhaps managing a bid management as well. And a bid team, for instance, could even just be comprised of a member of staff from each department just to help create a more thorough, comprehensive bid. Just so you got involvement, you got engagement from different areas of the business, there's vested interest into ensuring that the bid can be as good as it can be. No one's waiting on information, and that you can bid on time and at the level that the buyer requires as well. So as a key takeaway, don't be shy about selling yourself to the buyer and explaining what the benefits that you have to offer as clearly as and as simply as possible. And certainly that the objective measure for that, as I mentioned previously, is that evaluation criteria. So planning for success, early engagement is absolutely key, really. I think how do you win more? I think your business can win more by enabling a much more proactive approach in the bid management process. So that could be long before a tender notice, for instance, has even been established. So early engagement is always welcomed in any sector. Is welcome from a buyer perspective, welcome from whoever the client is who's actually publishing the tender. That's always going to be welcomed. It shows interest. It shows interest in the company as a worst case scenario. It shows that you're being proactive in your understanding of the market. You're trying to position yourself in the market, and it also it's a good lever for continuous improvement as well. So you can always pick up nuggets from certain conversations within early engagement as well with buyer organisations where, for instance, if they're in a private sector environment, for instance, if they have a strategy in place, or if they're embedded with the suppliers, they've got contractual terms or framework in place for another 2-3 years. At least that gives you an opportunity just to plan internally, do a bit of business planning in terms of how you can get ready in 18 months time, perhaps even a year's time, to start to get ready to bid for that, start to open up conversations, open up doors internally with the client that you're hoping to partner with. It also helps plan your resource needs and manage risk and time and hours burnt internally on bidding for projects as well. So it just gives you that upfront engagement. A key really as well, I've outlined here as well in terms of the list of questions that I've outlined for early engagement is references. So do you have any similar references that may be of a similar value, projects you bid on before that you can take the buyer through, that will be on the scope and scale of what you've done and what you're looking to actually bid on here? Looking at whether the actual contract that you're bidding for is right for you as well. So perhaps look at the size of the contract, look at the size of the organisation, where is it located? Are you an SME that services or majors in a particular region? and the contract may be, on the other side of the country, for instance, or perhaps, in another country, in another continent, for instance. So it's always careful just to assess that level of work and to ensure whether it's financial viable. Is key ultimately. Will it make you a profit? Can you reasonably hedge that you'll be getting some adequate returns for in bidding for the project? I guess the golden rule attached to bidding on anything from a financial perspective is that the contract shouldn't really be worth more than about 50% of your annual turnover, because then you do really risk putting your eggs in one basket, and then there's a number of issues associated with that. So I'll probably keep that as a bit of a golden rule. And each industry, each business is different as well, but I think as a general rule, that's what the industry normally sticks to. So looking at your differentiators as well, so what are your organisation's USPs? Do you operate in markets or offer a competitive product or service that others can't? If so, great, include it in your proposal. Try and base your proposal around that. Try to put that out there to the buyer as early as possible, perhaps even before they get to the tender stage, just so they can they get a heads up of that. It could be a case that in the private sector, certainly, that an organisation may lean on you to help put together a technical specification, which would only help your application and your proposal going forward. Does it fit within your long-term strategy is a key point as well. I think a lot of organisations, they may be phasing out products and services at this point, so they may have an interest to keep online a product for perhaps the initial 3 to 4 years, but beyond that, there may be issues in perhaps servicing it beyond there. So that's certainly a consideration. Do you have the resource and time? Again, the key point that we touch upon a couple of times here. So I think in terms of resource, it's key to actually put that forward during your bidding process as well. So a lot of firms actually value having putting together a project plan. So potentially, if you put together a timing plan as to how you're going to deliver a product or service, which members of your team are going to be on the job, perhaps through a hierarchy. Names, CVs, what's their experience and capability there, what value they can bring to the organisation. That's certainly going to drive forward a much stronger response. And I think the closing consideration really is that I implore clients really just focus on is, would you choose yourself for this? So would you put yourself in the buyer's shoes? If you put yourself in the buyer's shoes there and look at your bid, look at what you offer, look at your workload, look at your proposal compared to the other competitors, how good is your offering on paper? And if it stacks up well against the market, great. It looks like you're in a reasonable position, at least a level position. But is anything above and beyond that you could potentially engage the customer with, and what the buyer requires from that perspective? And thank you very much. That's the core of the presentation. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to go through a Q&A session now, but thank you for your time.
Lovely, thank you for that, Sukraj. I think I'll just open up the floor to any questions or any comments. So I just encourage you to maybe just have a think about the information. Quite a lot of information there, which is great. And maybe just if you haven't got a question, just pop in the chat box kind of what your key learning was of today, or your key takeaway, something that maybe resonated with you particularly, or something that you knew but had forgotten about. Or, like I said, if you have any questions or any particular challenges when it comes to public sector, to any form of tendering, maybe just pop it in the chat for us and we'll see what comes up there. Okay. Just give it a couple of minutes for people to think of any questions. Sometimes they can be quite long. I'm surprised to know that the private is not like the public.
Absolutely, yeah. Very, very different rules and regulations as well on that, Ahmed. I mean, from a route to market perspective, there's risks on both. There's a lot of transparency, obviously, on the public side, but then you don't necessarily get that transparency on the private side. But then couple it with dynamism as well. The private sector is a lot more dynamic in terms of it can move quicker. There is that quicker speed to market. You can contract quicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one question, will the slides and recording be shared, please? Yep, the recording is going to be shared, absolutely. So anybody that registered for this event will have access to that. Obviously, if there's anyone else within your organisation that needs to see it, then obviously that would be available to them. So it takes us normally a day or two just to get that out to you. So we will definitely be sharing that with anyone registered and anyone that attended today. So a question then, so from Stacey, I've seen tenders that are 70 pages plus long. How much depth do you think they really read into the businesses buying, by the businesses buying, sorry?
It's an interesting question. A lot of that, I would say, is largely just standard boilerplate. I mean, it'd be interesting just to see whether it's public or private sector on that as well. Let's assume it's a public sector. A lot of that is stuff that they can't necessarily change. I think I mentioned that during the deck as well, that everything has to be compliant with PCR regulations, PCR 2015, which anything in the public sector has to be compliant with those regulations. So on the back of that, there's a lot of standard stuff that they can't necessarily touch that has to be included in. But in terms of, say, from a proposal perspective, if you were to submit, it's not necessarily the case of less is more neither. I think what I would do is just tailor your submission to what the buyer requires. I think it really goes back to what the final slide talks about, which is early engagement. If you have that early engagement, you'll know early on as well as to how you can sort of tailor your proposal to what the buyer requires. So and I think in that regard as well, you'll know what's important to them. If you know what's important to them, you can hit them with those salient points. You can tailor your solution around what the valuation criteria is as well. And I think you're not necessarily marked as such on unless the evaluation criteria is structured that way. You're not necessarily marked on the length of your proposal, such as to what you put forward. You're not necessarily marked on that. It's more from what's within it as such. So if it's 70 pages of great content, great. If it's 15 pages of great content, the buyer will know that it's 15 pages of great content.
Yeah, I think it comes back to knowing who you're selling to, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
That's kind of key across kind of any new business development. Really, is understanding what it is your customer wants. So I've got a question for you, and I know you did cover this, but just maybe it's a good point to reiterate. Is about the feedback when you're unsuccessful, and I think this is something that you touched on, that companies struggle sometimes to get that kind of feedback loop closed. Have you got any tips on how people can get that feedback so that they can be more successful for the future?
Yeah, sure. So let's say, for instance, let's take it from a private sector perspective. So say if an SME was unsuccessful in bidding for a contract in the private sector, I would try and push for that feedback on the basis that it furthers continuous improvement from your side as well. Although public and private sector organisations are not necessarily obligated to actually provide that. The expectation would be, if you've had that early engagement as well, you've had a chance to build up that relationship. Good practice from the organisation's perspective in the private sector would actually tell you that they would actually share that information. So I think in terms of tips to try and get that information, I would sort of pitch it around perhaps in terms of ensuring that the bid is correct next time. And from a market perspective, depending on whether it's a constrained market or more of a less volatile market as such, it could be a case of just ensuring that, in terms of if there's a requirement going forward next time, you're able to service that. And I would pitch it around that. But from a public sector perspective, it has to be provided anyway. You should be pushing for that. Although I still caveat that it's best practice for public sector organisations to provide feedback.
Yeah, and you mentioned it there about the early engagement. Asking them at the beginning, if for whatever reason we are unsuccessful, would you be willing to give me feedback, and kind of laying that out, and then so when you go back for that, maybe they're a little bit more kind of forward with that, perhaps. It is hard though, isn't it? I think, like you say, with the private sector. We've had another couple of questions. A tricky one here, I think. So how do you get around the issue with some tenders where you can't speak directly to the customer as part of the procurement rules? This would help with engagement, but we find it difficult if we can't speak to the customer. I wonder, Helen, if you could just maybe elaborate on the can't is do you not, they won't speak to you, so they are refusing to speak to you, or is it you don't know who the end customer is because it's through maybe a couple of different channels? Or maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
I think perhaps the angle that, if we can approach it from, which is a very common issue as well, is the fact that a buyer effectively would like to control that communication. So yeah, as you mentioned, Helen, around the procurement rules, all communication should be sent through the buyer in that regard, within the public sector space in particular, and good practice would be in the private sector too. However, the buyer should be ensuring that there is that forum for you to actually just to engage with the end user. So, for instance, let's use an example. Let's say it's a very technical piece of engineering work that's required. The buyer's working with an engineering manager and then a team of engineers on that, but you're trying to contact the engineers to speak, technical speak, and to actually put together a solution. The buyer should be offering you a window of engagement for clarifications. So, for instance, when a tender goes out, there should be, say, I don't know, say if it's a 2-week time to return, hypothetically, they should be offering you 5 days to actually review the tender pack, to pull together a list of clarifications, to actually submit through to the buyer. The buyer then can actually take that to the technical team and actually refine that. So it could be in the form of, say, a forum that's set up, whether it's like in the form of meetings, video calls in this day and age, or in the form of actually questions, effectively clarification questions that can be put forward to the technical guys.
Yeah, I think Helen's just added on there. There's a forum for clarifications, e.g. a portal, but we'd prefer just to have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely understand that as well, Helen. So from the onset as well, I would actually push for that, and just to ask around the clarifications. When you get the tender pack, in regards to clarifications, is a buyer able to facilitate a meeting as part of that, or is it just going to be directed through the portal? It is a bit horses for courses to a degree, depending on the sector.
So another one here. So public sector tendering, in our experience, is very time consuming and margins are tight. Private sector bidding is all about supply chain relationships. It can be hard work getting on customer supply chain, but when you achieve it, the availability of tenders and opportunity for better margins is usually there. Repeat business is key for us. So I think that's more of a statement on that one. So yeah, that's some kind of good advice there, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So we have got another question. I think this will be our final question, I believe. How much would assistance from a professional advisor increase the success chances if a small company is getting into tendering for the first time?
Very good question. So it's it depends on, I guess, if you have a contract in mind, if you have a project in mind as well, depending on the complexity of it and what your in-house resource looks like, if you've got the data ready to go, depending on what the buyer's requirements are as well. So, for instance, buyers may require more of a light touch, or may put out more of a light touch tender pack, which obviously require different workload from both the client and the customer in terms of actually bidding on the buyer's on the buyer's tender. However, if it's more in depth as well, there will obviously be that wider stakeholder engagement required as well. I think from a success perspective, it's the real success is in leaving a lasting legacy. And I think it is, it's all well and good getting advisors come in to actually assist with a piece of work, but what's the end result of that? What's the lasting legacy? The lasting legacy really should be that the team, the in-house team, have an understanding how to upskill their own staff, an understanding about how to train their own staff and be more successful next time. So I think the lasting legacy really, and I think the true measure for success is that lasting legacy as to how organic are those changes that can be made.
Absolutely. And I think with anything, as soon as you do start working with an expert and a professional expert in their field, be it, bid management and tendering in this case, you know, you surely the chances are only going to increase of success. And as you say, you also will hopefully learn a lot, you know, throughout that process of working with that advisor, and that probably can't be underestimated, how much, you know, you actually understand more, and like you say, become more successful in perhaps future tenders as well. It's probably a bit of I imagine a bit of a rolling stone gathers moss. The more you do, the more successful you are. The more you'll do, the more successful you are. So it's I imagine it's one of those things that businesses have to just get into the habit of. You know, if that is going to be your kind of business strategy, you know, maybe for, you know, it's one of those things you want to try for 18 months, 2 years to see how you get on going for these types of more bid management style works, perhaps.
Sure.
I mean, you'll probably have experience of that with your customers.
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed.
Fab. Okay, so it doesn't look like that. I think that was our last question from what I can see. If anybody does have any questions that come to them after this webinar, then Sukraj has helpfully popped his email address in the chat. If you miss it, we will pop it out with the follow-up to this. So I think all that's left to do is to thank everybody for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Sukraj, Gail, and the team, because this was also, you know, kind of worked together with the team at JDP Procurement as well, for your time and for kind of giving all this great information today. Hopefully everybody's got something from it. And yeah, just, you know, have a good rest of your day, and I will hopefully get this information out to you by the end of Friday. So you'll have all of this available to you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.